Sawadee Karp, hello and welcome to another Victor Black Masterclass video. In today's video, I'm going to give you 8 quick tips for safer PED use. So let's get started with the video. Step 1. This is something that I understand that people might not appreciate at first pass, but in my opinion, it's probably the singularly most important aspect or element of creating a strategy, a long-term strategy for safer use, and it is fundamentally simply this: admitting to yourself that what you are doing has risk attached to it. In my opinion, this is profoundly important. Why? Because it is from that understanding then that we can put together a strategy that is intended to minimize that risk, and we can ensure that we are diligent in executing that strategy. Very often you hear guys that are incredibly dismissive of the risks of use of these types of compounds, and in my opinion that is a massive mistake. It's a huge mistake. In my opinion, you are better off over positioning the risk attached than under positioning the risk attached. For example, I personally think that the greatest risk to our health from the long-term use of these compounds probably lie in the organs, the brain, the heart, and the kidneys. These are the most vulnerable organs to extended PED use. Very often you will hear people talk about the risk to the liver, hepatotoxicity, and in my opinion, this is an overstated risk. However, if you take the position that it is still a risk, don't dismiss it. Say, okay, so there are compounds out there that potentially do have toxicity attached to them when we use them. Then you begin the discussion about risk mitigation from the best possible position, rather than blowing it, dismissing it straight out of hand. So step 1 in this video: admit to yourself that what we are doing does have risk attached to it, and from that premise, from that point forward, we can then create a strategy that is designed to mitigate or to minimize that risk to the greatest degree possible. Okay, so step 2. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and I think that guys over the last perhaps 5 years have gotten way better at doing this, but there is still, in my opinion, room for improvement. Okay, and that is understanding that we are very lucky in 2019 that we have basically on-demand testing facilities. You can basically access pathology labs almost exclusively around the world. There are a couple of countries that are more difficult than others, but particularly in the US, in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, there are on-demand testing facilities that you can literally kind of walk into, say, I want to get these health markers tested, pay money, and have them basically presented to you on demand. And this is fabulous, in my opinion. That, in combination with a couple of simple home testing devices, specifically a blood pressure monitor and a blood glucose monitor, mean that we are so much better informed than they were in the 1970s and the 1980s, where you literally had to go to your doctor, and then this doctor was reluctant very often to call up certain testing markers. It's just amazing that you can walk into these pathology labs today in most parts of the world, as I said, and tick the boxes and say, tell me how I'm doing in this regard. Absolutely phenomenal. And in my opinion, we should be taking advantage of that. I have material on what testing I recommend. For the purpose of this video, it is enough to basically just say, you know what, if you're doing doctor prescribed TRT, you are probably going to find that your doctor is going to send you off for blood work every 6 months to keep an eye on markers like hematocrit levels and certain stress markers that are impacted even at TRT levels. And if you are using self-administered, particularly research chemicals, veterinary products, all manner of things that we tend to use as PEDs today, you, in my opinion, should be even more vigilant than that. So if the doctor is wanting to send you off for health marker testing every 6 months, because he's writing you a prescription for 150 milligrams of testosterone or 200 milligrams of testosterone, doesn't it make sense that we're even more vigilant than that, right, when we consider what we are doing? And I recommend, guys, get health marker testing on the following basis. Purchase a blood glucose meter, purchase a blood pressure monitor, measure both of those every week as part of your ritual. Go and get health marker testing, blood work testing on the major organs of the body, the liver, the kidneys, the prostate, the heart, the lipid values, really every 12 weeks. You could even make an argument that you should probably be doing it more than that if you're really blasting away. But every 12 weeks I think is a reasonable compromise. 6 months for TRT, 12 weeks for true PED use, and that includes SARMs and research chemicals. Any drugs that basically you are self-administering that we don't have fabulous clinical data on to support their safer use fall into that category. Don't delude yourself that because you're quote unquote just using a research chemical that is lower risk. That is indeed higher risk because we don't know the long-term consequence of deployment. Then one final layer on top of that, I recommend that everybody once a year goes and gets some sort of cardiovascular screening done. Yes, it is true to say that we can have some insight into the impact on our cardiovascular system through lipid management, lipid monitoring, but ultimately, direct screening is the next step up from that. Once a year is a practical number, in my opinion, for early detection of any issues that are going to present themselves. Right. Step 3. If you're going to be in this game for the long term, now I am not necessarily talking about professional bodybuilders here. Why do I say that? If you look at the career span of most professional bodybuilders, it's actually relatively short. Like most professional athletes, professional bodybuilders have for want of a better word, a use by date, and that's usually about 8 to 10 years. There are some exceptions. There are some extraordinary exceptions like Dexter Jackson, but most guys are in and out of that game within about 8 to 10 years. Now, if that's you, I understand you're probably not even watching my materials, but if you're interested in longevity, one of the tenets of longevity is to always seek out the minimum effective dose, all right? Yes, more works more. You're never going to get an argument from me that more doesn't work more, all right? And there's always the temptation to use more. But if you're interested in safer use and if you're interested in longevity, the discussion that begins with, so what's the smallest dose that I can use? And at the same time, realize whatever your goals are, this is a sensible and rational starting point for that conversation. Okay. The extension of that then becomes the micro dosing of esterified compounds. And what that means in short is this. Historically, when drugs were basically created with esters attached to them, they were administered on the longest practical frequency between administrations for the purposes of convenience, where we basically went to the doctor's practice and had a dosage of testosterone or whatever compound it was, trenbolone, when it was in human use, every 10 days, every 14 days. Now, the consequence of that is that therefore you are exposed to a very high peak value following the administration of that dose that then drops off in a time-dependent manner based on what ester is being used to a point where you basically need to re-administer the compound 7 days, 10 days later. So you have a very high peak value and you have a trough that needs to be dealt with. Now, that's not ideal for a number of reasons, not the least of which is understanding that that peak value is therefore what we're exposing ourselves to in terms of side effects. And by increasing the frequency of administration, holding the dosage the same, but increasing the frequency to every other day or even every day in some circumstances, you massively change the side effect profile of these drugs, because you are literally exposing yourself to the smallest peak possible and the smallest trough possible. And so microdosing of esterified compounds has the potential to massively minimize consequence of use to recreational users of these drugs. If you want to find out more about that, I have material in the master's class that talks in detail about microdosing and the consequence of deploying this strategy. Right. Step 5. Understand and recognize that there is a difference between what we would refer to as safer use compounds and research or experimental drugs. At a simplistic level, let me explain. There are some anabolic and androgenic steroids that have been in human clinical use for many decades, right? There are other anabolic and androgenic steroids that have never been approved for human use that are effectively veterinary drugs, and hopefully people would appreciate that there are different safety profiles between approved for human drugs, approved for human use drugs rather, and drugs that are for animals, okay? So whenever possible, what we want to do is create the foundation of our application or our PED use around the drugs that are considered to be safe for use. Now, very often I accept these are not the sexy drugs. These are not, the quote unquote most powerful drugs that we have at our disposal. And people are always going to be interested in using those drugs to some degree. I do that as well. When it comes to competition time, I use drugs like Trenbolone. I don't live on the drug though. It is a drug that I use on a as required based on my goals basis. And this should apply to your choice of compound across the board. By all means, you can experiment with different drugs. I enjoy experimenting with different drugs, but that is not the backbone, it's not the foundation stone of my PEDU strategy. The foundation stone of my strategy is safer use compounds like low dose testosterone. And if you want to then bring other compounds in on a rotational basis that you experiment with and say, well, what does this do and what does that do? I don't think anyone's going to bust your balls from that. The issue, the point of this slide is you shouldn't be making a strategy, a long-term strategy founded on basically research or experimental drugs. That doesn't make very much sense. Those drugs are for research. Those drugs are for experimenting. And if you want to do that, fine. But use them occasionally, use them sporadically, use them sparingly. Try them and look at them laid on top of a foundation of drugs that have been in clinical practice and used for many decades. Right? That hopefully just makes enough logical and rational sense that guys goes, yes, I understand. There's a time and a place for experimentation. There's a time and a place for looking at some of these new emerging peptides and research chemicals, but they shouldn't be forming the foundation stone of your entire strategy. That's not responsible use. Okay, so next step in the process, I apologize, hang on, I'll click forward here, is we need to understand that the use of these compounds causes oxidative stress. It just does. This is beyond dispute. And so we have to be in a position to understand that that oxidative stress needs to be mitigated. And the way we do that, the foundation behind which we do that, is that we consume a diet that is rich in micronutrients, antioxidants, and phytonutrients. Okay, now phytonutrients is a fancy sounding word for basically saying these are chemicals produced by plants that have both antioxidants and anti-inflammatory benefits. Anyone that follows my content would be aware that there is a absolute argument to be made that the overuse of anti-inflammatories and antioxidants can actually have a detrimental effect on hypertrophic outcomes. I support that as well. But you really, are not going to find that through the consumption of a diet rich in these compounds. That really comes down to the use of pharmacological agents like the overuse of metformin, for example. So you should be, in my opinion, out eating Citizen Joe by a factor of manyfold. You should be putting him to shame with how well you eat, quote unquote. And unfortunately, most bodybuilders, most people seeking hypertrophic gains have appalling diets. They literally still today have appalling diets. Has it improved in the last 10 years? I would say yes, definitely. People today, though, still are focused on macronutrient profile, protein, fats, and carbs. And the reality is that that's child's play. Anyone can basically put a high protein, moderate fat, moderate carbohydrate on the diet on the table. Very simple to do, right? The challenge and the complexity in this is making sure that we get enough micronutrients and antioxidants and phytonutrients from this diet as well to meet our stress needs, okay? And the only way you can practically do that, in my opinion, is through a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, and plausibly, potentially even have supplementation layered on top of that as well, right? There's absolutely an argument to be had about the supplementation of compounds like taurine and other antioxidants that I fully support their use, but they go on top of this diet. And most guys still don't eat this way, right? And as I said, if you're interested in longevity, if you're interested in being in this game for a long time and being enhanced for a long time, you need to, as I said, step one, accept the fact that there's risk attached here. Oxidative stress from the use of anabolic compounds is not a maybe. It's an absolute certainty. We know this beyond discussion. The question is, so what do we do about it? How do we offset that? The bro science argument is, well, you take enough pills and potions and hope that you have that in place. The intelligent, rational, logical person says, I'm going to have a diet that is absolutely fabulous in terms of its, diversity of these vegetables and fruits and intake, and then I'm going to make sure that I get enough protein, fats, and carbs. Really is secondary to that, because that's the easy part. Getting enough protein is not hard, all right? Particularly with the amount of food that larger guys consume. There's plenty of room. I will actually acknowledge that it's far more complicated for women to get enough micronutrients in their diet than men, principally because they tend to have smaller caloric intakes, and getting enough protein, fats, and carbs and getting all the micronutrients in, particularly when you have a caloric deficit, can be very challenging. Not hard for guys to do. You just need to be, one, aware of the need. Many guys are not. And then to diligently create a model that basically provides all of these things in abundance. Okay, step 7, something that is not spoken of, or at least overly discussed in our community, and that is seeking out high quality sleep. Okay, there are many things that we do today that are environmental that degrade the quality of our sleep and recovery, and giving our body both the nutrients it needs and the sleep it needs to basically manage the stress that comes in our world, in our tribe, is paramount. You need to seek out high quality sleep. All right. So again, there are a whole raft of recommendations one could make about this, from avoiding blue light to avoiding ambient light conditions to getting up early in the morning and exposing yourself to natural lighting conditions, and the point of this video is simply to say, look, you need to invest time into understanding sleep hygiene and how you improve it if you want to minimize the stress on your body from the use of these types of compounds. Okay, and the last one is something that I guess it's very difficult to broach this subject with quote unquote bodybuilders, but I am very passionate about this and understanding that, look, we all want to create, to a certain degree, significant increases in body mass, in body weight, right? But plausibly, the singularly biggest health implication there is to enhanced training is actually not the drugs themselves, but the consequence of basically just mass. And what I mean by that is we're talking about big guys here. I sometimes hear guys that are 150 pounds or 160 pounds saying, like the 200-pound guy is at greater risk of X, Y, Z than those. I don't subscribe to that. What I'm talking about is this. Walking around at 280, 290, 300 pounds in the off season for 20 years just isn't healthy. All right. So I'm talking about the pursuit of extreme mass. Now, I am right now off season about 260 to 270 pounds, somewhere in there. And quite bluntly, that's a lot, right? Particularly for a guy who's over 50 years old, right? There is a part of me that wants to get bigger. I admit that. I acknowledge that. I'm very transparent about that, but I restrict myself in that capacity because I know it's just not fucking good for you. The amount of weight that you carry around long term, the amount of food that you need to consume, and as a consequence of that, potentially the amount of training stress and the amount of pharmacology that you need to use to pursue more is probably the singularly biggest health implication there is. All right. So just think about that if you're interested in longevity. How big do you really want to be is the question. Yes, I understand if you want to be an open class, competitive bodybuilder today, you're probably going to need to be of significant body weight to be competitive in that class. We all understand that. But the reality is that pursuit is probably the singularly biggest issue there is in terms of long-term health in this domain. Okay. I myself are probably getting to the point where I go, you know what, that's enough weight. 260 pounds off season is just enough. Stop, basically. And I would encourage anyone who's a larger guy, right, and an older guy to consider that, right, because I think that that's probably the consequences of pursuit of mass, the consequences, the food, the training stress, the pharmacology, and the overall body weight, which means that you typically have higher blood pressure and you have this and you have that and all these things going on, is probably the singularly most detrimental consequence to our health long term. Okay, so think about that. How big do you really want to be? Do you really need to be that big? Okay, and maybe resetting your goals, resetting your sights is something as you get older that you need to do. It's probably something that I will start to do in the coming years, start looking at it and going, you know what, I need to probably cap the limit of how big I get off season. I don't really want to, very honest about that. I like being, 250, 260 pounds, I like being that weight, but I am honest when I say it's not fabulous for your health. Okay, it's not. So these are 8 very simple steps that, in my opinion, can contribute to a safer framework with the use of performance-enhancing drugs. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. If you're looking for more information, you can go to my website at muscleand9.com. There is expanded content on all of these steps. And I look forward to seeing you at the next Victor Black Masterclass. Sawadee Ka.